Hi, this is Bobby Cobb with the Presence Posse, and I'm joined today with my partner, Dr. Fred Blum. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about presence and fear. But before we get into that, Fred, if you would be so kind as to introduce yourselves. I know that so many people consume this in just an audio version, so the little banners that we have playing on the video version all throughout don't always get translated over to there. So,
Well, that explains, what so many people have told me throughout my life that I have a face for radio. Um, I was waiting to see if that. Anyway,
I've heard that about my
so
voice.
well, that's actually true. Um, anyway, so about me, what is there to say? I live here in Austin, Texas. I'm a coach. I work with successful people who want more out of life than just the typical definition of success, which is, money or lots of cool toys or whatever it is you define, and then realizing maybe there's more to life than this. And I help them to find it. And we'll probably explore some of the ideas about how that happens in the next hour.
I imagine we will. And I will say one of the great joys of my life is getting to be able to spend an hour with you and our other posse members every week. It's like a really in depth exploration into this material on a weekly basis, which is really cool. My name is Bobby Cobb. I am a liberation hypnotist. That means I use hypnosis to wake people up as opposed to putting them asleep. I also am a mindfulness coach and a meditation instructor. And for the most part, I like my ideal client, the one that I really seem to have the most impact with in our relationships, are folks that are have been on a very good achievement path. They've set goals and they've achieved those goals and they've set higher goals. And they did that with the idea that there was a mountain that they were climbing. And once they got to the top of that mountain, they would be happy and blissful and just hanging out. And oftentimes that's not the case for people. It's kind of like, is this it? Where's the party? Where's the parade?
Mhm.
And I work with people to help see that the source of that joy and contentment and inner bliss is within us. It's not out there in the world of objects and the perceived reality. And today we're talking about fear. And this came up to me as a topic a while back at the metaphysical library that I am a member of. And we had somebody there that was talking about fear and asked us
Mhm.
in kind of a trancy sort of a conversation to go within and get in touch with some fear that we had and to just explore our relationship with that. And the thing that was interesting to me was as I
Mhm.
went with inside, I couldn't pull up any current fear. I could remember times in my past that I had fear, but it didn't really have the charge that the person who was running this particular exercise was looking for. And I just thought, well, it's so interesting. And some of the conversations that other folks had indicated that their relationship fear was different. So I thought it would be interesting to explore fear and possibly using it as a tool to gain presence and to do a little bit of self inquiry and maybe just as a rumble strip on the highway of life. And I thought that would be a fun exploration for us. And Fred, I know you had some thoughts that you're like, man, I love this topic. I want to dive into it. So, what are some
Mhm.
initial thoughts that came up for you when we introduced this topic?
Well, I tell you, one that just came up for me when you said using fear as a tool for self awareness or something like that. Um, I agree with that, but I tell you, that's a tough one to start with because the nature of fear is that it can be very gripping. I mean, that's certainly true of some other emotions too, but maybe because fear is perhaps more primal, it's directly tied to that fight or flight response. The other possible one that could be really tough to work with would be anger, I think, for the same reason. So you have to, I would think, if you really want to use something like fear as a way to become self aware, like in other words, learning to sit with your fear, um, I would highly suggest learning to breathe,
Mm,
um, and maybe a couple of other principles along the way, but certainly learning to breathe if you do it well, because you got to be able to take that fear down to a point where you can be the witness of it. Um, Otherwise, if it's up here, you're going to be identifying with it, and it's very hard to do awareness practices when you are the thing that you're supposed to be looking at. Right? Does that make sense?
yeah,
Um,
totally.
so, uh, since we're talking about fear in general here, not just as an awareness practice, uh, I think breath is something important to discuss anyway, because again, fear is such a primal, deep, amygdala response,
Yeah, it gets you.
so quick, um, and probably 99% of the time, I don't know, 99, but a large percentage of the time, we're probably unconscious of it, and so it's it can be problematic. It can really sneak up on us, and over time, because the brain tends to reinforce any thought or action that we take repeatedly, you will become, fear could become almost like a background emotion that just lives inside you. Um, and you don't
Right.
even notice it anymore. It's just in the background all the time. But if, and this is why some people, I suspect, are very hesitant to do something like meditation, or they're the kind of person that is always filling the spaces in a conversation. That they don't like the pauses,
Afraid
the
of the
silent.
silence, right?
Exactly, because where they're always distracted when they're home, they're on their phone or they're doing something. It's because in those quiet moments, they might have to be present with that fear, and that can be scary for people, you know, to go there. So it's not a judgment. I mean, hence learning to breathe. If we really let ourselves learn how to breathe, and I mean, I'm happy to get into some of this. I'm sure you have some thoughts on that too. Um, it can almost within seconds, really 30 seconds, lower that level of fear, that fight or flight response, to something more manageable. So,
Well, and that fight or flight response, one of the things that tends to happen in the fight or flight response is very often if if we're out on the road and we hear a car kind of sliding and careening and there's a chance that it might hit us,
right,
our natural normal reaction, unconditioned, I mean, this is just like planted
right,
in the original manufacturing, is to take in a deep inhalation and hold it.
mm,
And
yeah.
so you talking about, if that can be a go-to thing, how is our breath? And just begin breathing, we're immediately beginning to play with that fight or flight response. Just
And one of the simplest ways to do that, again, to like, let's talk about a specific exercise, because it's one that anyone can do really, is to make your exhale a little bit longer than your inhale. Maybe like a 4-to-6 ratio or something like that. So you breathe in for 4 seconds, exhale for 6, or whatever feels comfortable for you. As long as the exhale is longer, it begins to change what's called the vagus nerve.
yeah,
And the vagus nerve is instrumental in the fight or flight response. It's the longest nerve in the body, which I'm not sure how that relates to this, but it's an interesting factoid. And when you learn to breathe consciously, and especially kind of like with the extending the exhale, it decreases what's called vagal tone, which is literally tension on that nerve, which leads to that fight or flight response. You know, um, so if we're talking about fear, presence, and fear, I mean, I guess the first step is just to be willing to notice that you're afraid, right? Notice
Yeah.
that there's fear in there, which, by the way, is pretty much true for everyone at some level. It's just, I say the ego, which is the identity that most of us have, and the part that's most afraid of getting caught, is created out of fear and insecurity. So it's wired into that identity. You can't ever be free of it from the egoic perspective. You can transcend it. And I
Yeah.
suspect you have some thoughts on that.
I do, but I want to kind of stick with the breath a little bit and the vagus nerve because we've mentioned that a little bit, but we've never really explored it. And this is a good opportunity to
Perfect
tap into
opportunity.
your medical training about that. We were doing at our library that I'm involved with. We did a new moon ceremony, and one of the things that we did was tapping into the power of psi, and not psi like psychology, but psi like ah. And the person who was doing the breathing instruction was talking about chanting and saying om over and over again, or just any type of vocal toning that evidently that vagus nerve goes down from our brain around our throat, down, wanders all throughout our chest cavity, I guess. You can fill us in a little bit more on that. But that toning or that sigh, like when if we are in a situation where we've held our breath and the situation passes, what's the reaction and the acknowledgement that it's passed? It's, oh, God, that was frightening there for a second. And that is a natural
Right.
response as well. So, one of the things that we were playing around with last Wednesday was doing that on purpose and by design with the idea that we are stimulating that vagus nerve and adjusting our vagal tone. Could you talk a little bit more? I mean, I was a participant in that. I don't really understand the science behind it, but I know that's kind of your world a little bit as a integrative chiropractor.
Well, maybe. um,
Okay.
so the question is, how does, what's that?
No, go ahead.
It seems like my my connection was a little dicey for a minute or
Mm.
so there while you were speaking. So, but I think I heard your question, and your question is, um, how does what is the science behind the vagus nerve, and what is the how does breathing affect it? Maybe.
Yeah,
Um, Here's what I can
and
say.
are we able to actually hack that response a little bit the by taking the conscious control of our breath and practicing 4 to 6 or 2 to 1, some type of breath work
Hmm.
where our exhalation is a little bit longer, or the toning part of it, where if we're just vocalizing and stimulating our throat. I noticed that I got a lot deeper, a lot more quickly doing that exercise the other night than is the norm. And I'm just wondering if there's actual science behind that that you're aware of, that's kind of hacking the system a little bit.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, in the whole biohacking thing that people talk about. I mean, not that this is new. I mean, Bobby, can you hear me?
You're definitely coming in and out a little bit. You're freezing up a little. You want to try signing out and signing back in? We seem to have lost Dr. Fred, and he's back.
Hello,
Or
how's
he's
that? Can you
not.
hear me now?
Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Your screen is
Sorry
frozen.
about this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Why don't you try signing out and signing back
Uh,
in?
I'm not sure. It seems to be it's been a little persistent recently. Anyway, you can hear me at the moment?
I can at the moment. Yeah, I don't know if it would help if you signed back out and signed back in again. That might be a way we could go.
Okay. I don't know. At the moment, it's working. Maybe it's not working.
No, it's not working. How about I'm going to try to type. Yeah, there we go. Fred is out, and hopefully he'll be signing back in a second. While we're waiting for him to return, in addition to that breathing that Fred talked about, the 4 to 6 breathing. So breathe in for 4 counts, breathe out for 6, or you could do 2 to 1, breathe in for 1 count and out for 2. And just that's the ratio. You're going to breathe out for, you might breathe in, for example, if you breathed in for 5, then you would breathe out for 10. If you breathed in for 4, you'd breathe out for 8. And I want to introduce you to another little technique that, in the moment that you are experiencing really deep fear, that I have found, this is a technique that I learned in a Reiki class. This technically is not Reiki, but the person who was the Reiki master was sharing this technique with us, which is very useful. It's called the 2 hand. Here comes Dr. Fred back again. All right.
Oh, is
Are
that
we
any
back?
better?
We still have, yeah, there's still a little lag in your
Can you
visual, but
can you hear me?
yep, I can hear you. Yep.
Oh well, all right. I don't know. Um, so far you can still hear me. We can go forward from here, I
Yeah, yeah,
guess.
yeah. Yeah,
No, you're
I
not.
can hear you great.
Oh, you are hearing me?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. We'll just go with that. Okay. So I'm going to try again. Apparently, there's a short lag in when you hear my audio. With regards to the science behind the vagus nerve, that's left off, correct?
Yep, yep.
Okay. Um, some of the, I mean, the vagus nerve is fight or flight. It's tied to, um, you know, the amygdala, which is the emotional part of the brain, and deeper into the spinal cord level of the brain. Um, and so the response of that we're talking about here is always going to be subconscious, and just the nature of the brain is that it's going to, if you stay locked in that response long enough, the brain is going to create enough circuitry that you could just stay in there all the time. And it doesn't recognize that it's essentially acting as though there was an emergency going on all the time.
Right.
And obviously we're not designed to operate that way. When you get into the fight or flight response, you're talking about physiological responses, elevated heart rate, increased muscle tension, faster, more shallow breathing. uh, Brain responses or emotional responses would likely be fear or anger initially, anxiety, something like that. I think over time, that response can become exhausting. And for some people, it ends up as depression or apathy or something like that. It's the same response, just, it's worn us out. It's worn out our adrenals and all this kind of stuff. So, one of the first things when we talk about science and how do we get out of this response by breathing, what we're doing is we are engaging conscious breathing, I'm talking about, with higher brain centers, you know, right up to the highest brain center, the most complex, the most developed, which is the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of our brain that, among other things, other really important human functions, is the part of our brain that creates context, that has us be able to look around, consciously see the world, and then be able to make a decision about that. Like, oh, wait a second, what am I so nervous about? That kind of thing. But it's hard to just come to that conclusion. If you've ever seen somebody who's really nervous, they're about to, give a public presentation or something, telling that person, don't be nervous, is kind of, right?
It's about as good as a customer
What's that
service person
expression?
telling the about as good as the customer service person telling the angry caller, "Don't be angry. Don't raise your voice." If anything,
Right,
it gets
exactly.
the opposite response.
What's the expression? Right, exactly. What's the expression? Never in the history of calming down has anyone calmed down by being told to calm down. It doesn't work that way. Um, so and there's a reason for that. It's because they're not operating from that cognitive, cortex level of the brain, which is later. That's the part that gives us the ability to think. So you certainly need that part online. And then not just if it's still like fight or flight dominant, your a product of that. So you start thinking in a way that creates more fear or more anger. But then we can, with breathing and maybe a little practice, we can activate the prefrontal cortex, which is the part that can say, yeah, what am I scared of? Or what am I angry about? Or maybe this is maybe they're having a bad day or something, like you said earlier. Maybe not to, judge this person too harshly. Um, so I think that something, yeah, as simple as breath can literally change our brain. And in doing so, it can, help us create better choices and stay out of that fear response, et cetera, et cetera. I hope
Yeah,
I was
that's
actually
beautiful.
broadcasting for that.
Yeah, that came through loud and clear and
Okay,
no
good.
lag, and it was friggin' brilliant. So you checked all of the boxes with that one. And as you were saying that, one of the things that, particularly like from a hypnotherapy standpoint, the questions that we ask ourselves and the searches that we go on are very important in the answers that we get back. So you can just imagine the difference
Hmm.
of somebody who would be that fear arises, and we have conditioned ourselves to recognize that when fear arises, that's a signal from the rumble strips of the highway of life telling us, hey, something's off here. If there's not an imminent danger, if you're sitting in your office or you're sitting in your house or your living room and suddenly fear arises, odds are good you're not in imminent danger. And if you just think of the difference between asking yourself, going on a mental search and exploration, and one exploration is, why am I scared right now? Why am I experiencing fear in this moment? Versus same stimulus happening, but a different response, asking yourself, what am I missing? I'm sitting here, I'm
Mm.
in my studio, I'm safe, I'm comfortable, I'm protected from everything, and yet fear is arising. What's going on? And just as a basis of inquiry, that it feels like the response that one is likely to get back from their unconscious mind is pretty dramatically different in those two.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
mean, obviously one's focusing more external and one's focusing more internal. And
yeah.
given that, none of us are actually seeing reality, we're just seeing our personal experience of reality. Um, Looking external versus internal are probably going to be quite different.
Yeah,
But I
it's
think,
it's a very different experience when we turn
yeah,
our mental resources and our bandwidth on the inside, and it just starts to go, okay, something's off here because externally there's no reason that I should be feeling this, so it must be something that's going on.
well, and the willingness, right, to be willing to sit with your experience, to slow down, to hold still, and to just really allow what's there to be there. That's really hard sometimes. And as we alluded earlier, I think it could be especially challenging with something like fear.
Yeah,
Um, and, so again, we talk about breathing, that's important. And that willingness aspect is really important too, because, I don't know if I've mentioned on this show before, but I have this 3-step framework that I created called 3 Steps for Effective Inquiry. In other words, this was what is inquiry. The ability, some inquiry is done with the mind, and some is done through the body.
hmm,
Um, and when we're talking about being willing to be present with an experience, a feeling, fear, emotion, whatever we call it, then that's inquiry, the somatic version. You know, uh, and so the 3-step framework is willingness, clarity, discipline. So the first step is you have to acknowledge, am I willing to do this? And I actually recommend that you ask yourself that, because sometimes we make the assumption that we're willing, or like I'm working with a client or you are, and we might just assume that they're willing to do a particular, go into a particular area that they might be scary for them, you know? And so by asking, are you willing, and them hearing themselves say, yes, I'm willing, I think creates a little more internal alignment. So we have less of this, like two parts playing tug of war. Um, and each step, willingness, clarity, discipline, also has a like a resource that it draws on. And so the resource for willingness is courage,
mm,
right? So once you decide, okay, I'm going to look at this, I'm going to be present with this feeling, it takes courage to say, okay, and the cool thing about courage is that it's available all the time. You don't have to like read a book about it or practice. I mean, practicing is good because you just gets easier to find, but it's here right now. So you could say, okay, I'm going to do this, and you literally draw on that resource to be willing to look, you know, and then the next stage is clarity. Clarity just means now I'm going to actually look. Now I'm going to see what's there or feel what's there. Uh, the resource that we use in clarity is, I like the word depth. Like we're not just going on the surface, we're going deep. We're going to let
deep.
ourselves feel it, all the aspects of it, how, especially with the body, how does it show up in the body? There's all nuances and little nooks and crannies where that stuff likes to hide. So you really learn to pay deep attention to yourself. And then the third step, discipline, just means that sometimes this is going to be hard. It's hard work. Just like exercise isn't always going to feel good. And so it takes discipline to be willing to sit in that space. And then the quality that goes with discipline is persistence, which means you just keep at it, when it's hard, when it's boring, you know, when something better is on TV, and you just keep going. You keep doing your best to keep coming back to the process, because I think that's going into like you said, the going inward. I think is the really only ticket that exists to true awakening. Yeah, we're not going to find it out there.
Yeah, and it doesn't take too much. One of the things that as people begin the process of going inside and just noticing, how are you doing right now? How are you doing? How are you relating to this
Hmm.
particular moment? That's a habit. And, that also, it requires a little bit of discipline to invite that and to agree that you're going to work on integrating this and habituating into it, into looking within. And it doesn't take very long before you begin to realize that while it does look like in the perceived reality that our circumstances are controlling how we're feeling on the inside, as you begin to explore with that, you begin to see there's times when you maybe are getting up to give a speech and you can't wait to do it.
Hmm.
And other times when you're thinking, oh God, this is going to be a disaster, blah, 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 blah. And the only thing that has really changed is your internal representation of the moment and how you're relating to that moment. And I can't
Hmm.
remember who said the quote, but there's a quote that floats around. You see it on Facebook and social media every once in a while. It's never the moment that is upsetting you. It's your relationship with the moment and
Oh
how
yeah,
you're
right.
interacting with the moment that is causing you whatever feelings that you're feeling about it. A rainy day, if you're planning
Hmm.
to have a picnic, is a disaster. A rainy day, if you've been suffering a drought, is the answer to your prayers. So it's all about the context and the way that we're reacting with and interacting with the moment.
I remember many years ago. It's funny you say that about the rainy day thing. I mean, this is a long time ago. I was 14 years old, and my brothers and I were in this sort of, wasn't exactly summer camp, but it was a place we'd go every day to hang out with, in a kind of controlled environment. And it was an outdoor thing, and it was pouring rain. And I thought, oh, this ruins our day. And um, the counselor woman said, well, I said, what are we going to do now? She said, I don't know. Let's go to a movie. I said, what movie? Because we didn't get to go to movies much in my family. We just never did that. And she said, what movie? I said, what movie? And she went, I don't know, Star Wars. And I went, oh, because I had like in my mind thought I would never get to see that. And it was like a moment where I saw how what looks like something really bad can turn into something really good that quickly. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that shift. I mean, what a gift to have been given that at the age of 14 and have it stuck, to sit there and think, you're like, oh, this sucks. We're not
Yeah.
going to get to do anything. And then all of a sudden, in that scenario, it's like the best thing that could have happened
Yeah.
just happened. I just
It was
didn't
like a
realize
dream
it
come
in the
true.
moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's I think something that, when we look at life, and I think this is very related to fear. Fear is like projecting a very specific future, even if it's not consciously doing that. It's catastrophizing, whatever. And if we look at life as a process rather than a series of events, like event, 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 if we see that life is continual, there really is no, that like it is completely arbitrary that we divide one event from the next. And we divide it on the basis of time, which we know is man made. That's the big way to do it. Or on activity, maybe like I was doing this and now I'm doing that, or on external events, whatever it may be. But it's made up. It's like we make up that they're somehow separate. And when we see that it's really, I mean, the reality is that life is an ongoing flow that we are somehow flowing through or is flowing through us, that's a whole other conversation. Um, we realize that if we stick around long enough, it's always kind of working out, it's, we get caught up in this moment. This moment is not fitting my precise specifications. And, if and we decide this is bad, life is unfair, whatever it may be. And if we just learn to breathe, take a breath, relax, let things unfold, you just never know where they're going to turn out, how they're going to turn out. And you lose the ability when you go into that fear response of interacting creatively with this moment. One of my other mentors, Steve Chandler, used to say, you know, given the current circumstances, what do you want to create? And I love that question because it
Yeah, that's a
suggests
great question.
it's a great question, right? Because whatever's going on right now, you could be caught up in how awful these circumstances are, or you can just think about what it is you want. And that's the essence of problem solving versus a creative orientation towards life.
Yeah, and it immediately ask that question again if you don't mind.
Given the current circumstances, what do you
What
want
do
to
you want to
create?
create? Yeah, if you, I'm just hearing people in when I ask a different version of that question without the given the current circumstances as a part of the context that we're answering, how often without that you get, well, I would like to do this, except
Right,
well, I'd like to build this organization, but that's going to require a massive team and I don't have that.
right.
So adding that, given the current circumstances, what do you want to create? That's it same sort of effect on the unconscious that we talked about earlier. Instead of asking what is it that I'm afraid of, asking what is it that I'm missing. And
Hmm.
it's your conscious mind is going to go delve into your unconscious and look for answers, and an answer will come back. And so it's fine to question that answer, and it's fine to ask a different question. If you don't like the
Hmm.
answers that
Yeah.
you're receiving, very often the answer to your struggle is to ask a better question or ask a different question.
One of the things I really like about that, oh, what was I going to say? I might have lost it, but you're training your brain essentially to to look for possibility, to step into possibility, you know, to be creative. And it may be hard sometimes. Maybe you're really disappointed about what's going on. And I would personally encourage you to let yourself experience that disappointment. Let that energy work its way through you. Oh, here's what I was thinking a moment ago. Is that when you learn though, after you've let yourself feel whatever you need to feel and not dwell in it, not get caught up in it, but after you're complete with that, to ask the kind of questions you're suggesting, what am I missing? Or given these circumstances, what do I want to create? Those are much more what we might call energy rich questions. Um, Model comes from a different mentor, Dr. Donnie Epstein, who talks about energy poor, energy neutral, energy rich as basically an indication of what our engagement with life is. So if we're engaging in life or any particular circumstance in life from an energy poor perspective, we're basically saying, I don't have the resources to deal with this, whatever it may be. If I'm sick, I don't have, and the resources might be my life energy, what runs and helps my body to heal, or it might be, I don't have the money to see a doctor, whatever it may be. That's energy poor. Energy neutral says, I'm just getting by. I have just enough energy to meet this challenge. So, um, yeah, I think I'll be better. I think I will get better from this. You're not going to learn anything from it. You're not going to grow from it, but you're going to get back to baseline, as soon as you can. Uh, and of course, that's the goal of a lot of people. Certainly, much of traditional, I mean, modern, quote unquote, modern medicine is to get you from below, like energy poor, with their help to energy neutral. And then But it doesn't really, medicine doesn't have any tools really to get people to what I call energy rich, or what Donnie Epstein calls energy rich, which is the feeling of abundance, the feeling of having more than you need, the feeling of having, like, whatever challenge life brings me, I got this, bring it on kind of energy. And all of this to say, those kind of questions tend to build energy, you know? So you were talking about the power of questions. Some questions build our energy, help us become more resourceful, more energy
Oh,
rich.
wow.
And some questions, by their nature, limit our energy, decrease our energy, buy into our limitations. How can just one person stand up against blah, blah, blah? That's a common question probably that gets asked,
Yeah.
you know? And what it does is it reinforces you as a small person. And then we have, why are these extraordinary people in history? Because they're the ones that were willing to answer that question. People like Martin Luther King or Gandhi. Notice you can't name too many. It's not
Yeah.
a common thing for people to really be willing to answer questions like that.
Well,
But to
there's a
look at it, what looks like a very energy poor situation, like me against a big corporation or something, and to find an energy rich like way to respond to that, that's quite a powerful thing.
yeah, the quote that came to mind, and I don't know that I can do it verbatim, but Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "Never assume that one dedicated motivation person cannot make a difference. Because if you study history, you will see in reality, it's the only thing that ever has
Right,
made a
right,
difference.
right.
Somebody who just cared so much and was so committed and just like a dog with a bone wouldn't let go of it is,
Hmm.
and that's a shift. If you're coming at it, I mean, that's a beautiful example of, what Donnie's principles are there, that if you come at it, who am I, one person, what difference could I possibly make? Then you're stacking the deck so far against you,
Right.
just in the assumptions that you're making and the asking of that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you and I, we were discussing before we went live here about, uh, I was saying I'm not really always a fan of rules, because rules without like the self-awareness to really, like, otherwise it's just the ego uses rules just to try and reinforce itself sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think there's exceptions to that rule, um,
The
which
rule to
is that,
not use rules.
right, right. Rule number one, there are no rules. Rule number
And
two,
here's the
except sometimes.
exception.
Yeah, right, right, right. Rule number two, don't follow rule number one. But one, like the idea of, even if I'm not feeling energy rich, maybe by asking more energy rich questions, I can change my internal state. And I think that that's a valuable thing to explore.
Yeah.
So like a rule might be, uh, and maybe there are exceptions to this, but I think it's a solid rule to explore, is, always try to ask the most energy rich questions that you can. Uh, in other words, questions that open possibility rather than close it. Given the current circumstances, what do I want to create? What am I missing here? Is a great question, because when you see what you're missing, you see what's possible, what you can fill in, what you can do. You know, um, you know, yeah,
Yeah, I love that. In NLP, one of the first things that a new NLP practitioner learns is the shift between good versus bad to useful versus non-useful.
right,
And
right.
in rules, I think, that is, we can have a useful rule for a
Hmm.
time and use it for a time. And, kind of think of it almost like training
Hmm.
wheels when you're teaching a little kid how to ride a bike. That's a good strategy for a time.
Hmm.
And then the time comes when you don't need them. anymore. And you can shift that to when I'm teaching financial advisors, one of the things that I teach them is every interaction that you have with a client is either going to deepen the relationship, it's going to work toward breaking the relationship, or it's going to have no effect. And if the financial advisor can make sure that he's focusing or she is focusing their energy and attention on the ones that are deepening the relationship, that tends to be a very powerful sort. And, going back to Donnie Epstein's a good thing to just check in with
Mhm.
yourself and say, is this adding energy? Is it expanding my energy? Or is it contracting my energy? Does it make me feel weaker, or does it have no effect? And to the degree that we're able to focus only on the one that is expansive or is adding energy or is energy rich, to use his language, if we can just make that little shift, the way that we show up and life shows up for us is going to start to have a cool little shift, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we're almost doing a segment on presence and questions here, which would be a good segment
Yeah, it would.
for
Yeah,
tonight.
so we could retitle this since we haven't actually delved into fear. Um,
Oh, we
yeah,
can? Okay. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I mean,
This could,
so what kind of questions, wh- what kind of questions could I ask? If I find myself all the time, not in imminent danger is a little different. So if you walk out the door and there's, in your house in Alaska, this could really happen. You could walk out the door and there could be a grizzly bear outside or something. I
yeah.
mean, it's
I
possible.
I, I
Um,
routinely and
that
actually
there's a
hear
different
moose.
response.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I get it. But the only point being, so like if you're in a literally dangerous situation, that's a little different as opposed to I notice that there's a low level fear or anxiety running in me all the time. So what I'm asking about here is what kind of questions might we ask in that situation in order to explore some part of us that may be operating on some old script, basically.
Yeah. Well,
Any thoughts on that?
yeah. Let's pull on that thread a little bit. The first one that I like is, if there is a quote unquote negative fear, and I always say quote unquote negative.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, well, I said fear. I meant emotion. If
Yeah.
there is
Okay.
what we typically categorize as a negative emotion, as we were doing this exercise the other day with fear, I noticed that when things don't go the way that I want them to, for me, and I think it's just the way that I'm wired. I don't really know this, and I've only recently begun exploring it. What shows up me more is anger than fear. And I noticed that with our uh, group at the library, that there were a lot of people that, as they were talking about what they were experiencing, were talking more about anger versus fear. So I'm interested in exploring whether or not that is like a primary sort that people make based on whatever conditioning they were brought up with. So I'm going to just
Yeah.
say anger
Boy.
and emotions are, or anger and fear are quote unquote negative emotions. I don't think they're really
Yeah.
actually negative. Go ahead.
I'm not one of those people actually that wants to label emotions and good ones and bad ones and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I get it. I would rather spend more time in joy than anger. Uh,
Yeah.
so it's not a complete like we should notice. Let's put it this way: whatever you're experiencing right now, whether it's anger or pain or sadness, that's your ticket. That's your entry point into joy. So the moment
Exactly.
the moment we label emotions as good or bad, we're missing the point. Um, the if we're stuck in it, if we're identifying with it, then it doesn't matter what the. And by the way, if you identify with happiness, like somehow it becomes an egoic thing, uh, probably then it's tied to some external event. It may be a lot of fun to be in that emotion, but you're still caught in the ego's web. You're still not really awake yet. Um,
Right.
so
Well,
doesn't
and that's the very reason that I use the air quotes,
right?
because
I get
I
it.
don't
Yeah,
find them to be inherently positive or negative. I look at
right.
them really more as just information. And
Yeah.
if we can get to the point when we recognize those feelings are arising and use that as a point of inquiry and as a pattern interrupt. So I use the term rumble strips on the highway of life, that when we're getting out of our lane on a lot of roads, they've got rumble strips, and your car is going to start to vibrate, and it's going to
Hmm.
kind of like wake you up, and that's just information. Get back in your lane. Where are you? Are you centered? Are you grounded? Are you traveling on the path that you're supposed to be traveling on? And as those arise, questions that we could answer or ask ourselves rather is, what's going on? What is it that's making me angry or fearful? And then the questions that I like even a little bit deeper and a little bit more designed to give the answer that you're looking for are questions like, what am I missing here? In
Hmm.
other words, to be angry in this moment, I must be working only with partial information. So therefore, what am I missing? Or another question that I love is, if this is a life lesson, what does this moment want me to learn?
Hmm.
And the answer might be, in reality, nothing, but just the mere fact that you're posing that question and now going into, the repository of every thought, feeling, and emotion that you've ever experienced, everything that you've ever learned, which is kind of how we think about the unconscious mind. We end up looking in a different part of the library of our mind for the answers that in all likelihood are going to be more empowering, and as Dr. Donnie would say, they're more energy rich. They're going to empower us to move forward in the
Right.
right direction. So those are two of mine. What do you like? What do you?
Well, I'll give you a couple that I think are these are only going to be useful after you've practiced for a little while. But once you understand a little bit of the context, like so, I spend a lot of time, and I think you do as well, spend a lot of time working with people to really understand the difference between a response that comes from ego or who they are when they're coming from their ego versus who they are when they're coming from the perspective of their true self. And um, so once someone has begun to be in that inquiry for a little bit, I can ask the question all the time: is that thing you're thinking, feeling, saying, doing, whatever, is that coming from the perspective of your ego or your true self? Now, spoiler alert: it's almost always going to be true self, at least a little bit. Sorry, I actually said that wrong. It's always going to be ego, at least a little bit. Um, And that's okay because the point of the question is to help shine a light onto that aspect of yourself that is in reaction or automatic, and so we ask the question, okay, am I doing or saying whatever, thinking from the perspective of my ego or my true self? And then you just wait and you notice, oh, like it's like the question is a meditation. You're not asking it like, all right, it's my ego, because then it's just like you got the right answer, but what did you learn?
Right, nothing.
um, but if you really wait, am I asking this, am I looking at this from the perspective of ego or true self? And then you pause for a moment and you'll typically get an answer. Now, let's say it's ego, then you've already begun the process of inquiry. You've already begun slowing down. So it might be good just to notice, oh, without even trying to get specific, like, what is this? Just go, oh, okay, this is my ego. My ego feels really afraid right now, or is really angry right now. So again, like you pointed out in the beginning, we're bringing it inside. Okay, sitting with that. Now maybe now for me would be a good time to go to the body. Okay, what do I notice in my body when I really notice? How is my ego showing up in my body right now? All right, I feel some tension in my chest and blah blah blah. You know, can I pay attention to that? And it might be uncomfortable to pay attention to it, but can I slow down? Am I willing? Can I find the courage to pay attention to that? Um, Again, with practice, you can. You just need to be able to slow down and say, all right. And it's amazing where that alone will take you.
Yeah.
If you just pay attention to that moment, to that feeling, I say this all the time, but it becomes like a door. It takes us into a glimpse of our true self, who we really are.
Yeah.
And
And
go ahead.
and those pauses, if you can use that as a cause to take a pause
Mm-hmm.
and just sit with that a little bit, that in and of itself becomes a pattern interrupt, because you've got this automatic playbook that's just going on, that we know what to do here, we know
Yeah.
how to act in these circumstances, and that is an unconscious ingrained habit pattern that we're unflowing all of the time. And if you accept Fred's invitation to sit with those emotions just a little bit, as soon as the pattern stops running, now all of a sudden it's like, okay, what's going on here? It's almost like if you've ever been in a movie theater, back in the if you're old enough to have been in a movie theater when there was actual film that was going in front of the
Right.
projector, every once in a while it broke. And
Yeah.
you would be in there in the movie, and this movie would be playing, and then all of a sudden the sound may become a little bit garbled, and the film breaks, and now the light is just projecting onto the screen, and whatever level of fantasy you were experiencing is interrupted, and you immediately start to wonder, what's going on? How long is it going to take them to fix it? But you can think of anything when those patterns get interrupted. And those are the spots when those little glimpses that Fred's been mentioning
Yeah.
occur,
Oh, when you
in that
experience the
space.
screen as just the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ramana Maharshi, who was a famous, theoretically enlightened sage back in the 1900s, uh, thought that, that the movie, he was around, I guess, when movies became first, a more popular thing. And he was in India, so it probably came considerably later than it did to this country. But he thought it was a wonderful metaphor for how the ego is like a movie that we're watching, and we become so engrossed in the movie. We've all done that. We've gotten so identified with some movie character where they're like, no, don't go in there, or I can't believe she went with him. And we're crying or angry or whatever, or glad when the bad guy gets his,
Yeah. Yeah.
like we're totally identified with the movie. And that's very much what we do is, with our ego, is we identify with the identity that we created rather than the truth of who we are behind the movie, which I say is the screen in this metaphor.
Yeah.
Um, but which brings me to one more question, and then I know we're about out of time today. Um, is so a question that Ramana Maharshi would ask in some version of, and again, these are the kind of questions that really only can be used effectively after a bit of practice. But whatever you're experiencing, let's say you're experiencing fear, um, the question that Ramana Maharshi might ask is, who is experiencing fear? or even what is experiencing fear. Like fear arises. What is the space in which fear arises? Who is the knower of that fear? And at first, if you haven't practiced very much, you might say, well, I am me, my ego. But the point would be to just keep looking, okay, and what is experiencing this ego is also being experienced. If you really can draw back a little bit, you can see that there's something that is aware of the me that seems to be having the fear. So there's like nested, like Russian dolls, um, and you just keep looking, who's having this experience? What is the space in which this experience arises? And eventually you see maybe the movie, gets knocked off the reel. And for a moment, you are just present with the space, the screen in which the movie was playing. And so fear, who is afraid right now? Who is experiencing this fear? Takes a lot of patience.
Yeah.
You may have to ask that question over and over again or for a long period of time. But, at least
And
according
have
to
a
Ramana,
willingness to dive in.
oh, yes. And to stay with it. Yeah. And according to Ramana Maharshi, that's all you need to do to become awake. You keep questioning the
Who
current
is it?
illusion. I'm sorry?
Yeah, who is it? Who is
Right.
it
Who
that's
am I? Who
seeing?
is it?
Who is it that, yeah, who
Yeah.
is it that's
I,
watching this happen?
you just keep questioning your experience until you see it for what it is for the movie, for the falseness of it.
Yeah, and that shift I have found is something that happens pretty quickly. If we ask the question, who is it that is experiencing this anger? Who's experiencing this
Hmm.
fear? That
Hmm.
mere stepping away from kind of brings us into almost like a witnessing consciousness.
Hmm.
And it's not unusual that when we ask that question and really go within, we see ourselves, this little image of ourselves, interacting with this moment. And when we have that realization, it's kind of like the that concept that we are spiritual beings having a human experience suddenly seems like that's the perspective that we're now watching this drama unfold through, and then realizing that we frequently go back and forth between those two, like from finite mind up to infinite mind and back down
Hmm.
again,
Hmm. Yeah.
everywhere in between.
Hmm.
While we had our little technical difficulty and you signed out and
Yeah.
then signed back in, I was using that time to teach a little technique that I heard and learned at a Reiki seminar I went to many years ago. I became a Reiki practitioner,
Hmm.
and one of the things that I learned, which I don't think this is formally taught in Reiki, but it is just the idea that if we are experiencing what feels as if it is an overwhelming level of fear or anxiety or anger, that becomes debilitating. And most people have had that experience that, it's just like I can't do anything. I'm just
Right.
so angry, whatever. Anytime that you're feeling an overwhelming thing, there's a technique called the two-hand stress disintegrator. So what
Hmm.
I'd love to do is, with your knowledge, I'll explain what I understand and just have you add anything to it. So here's the way I learned it. I don't know if there's any actual science behind this. I just know it works really, really
Well, then there's
well.
science behind it, whether we know what the science, whether science
Okay,
knows that there's science or not.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. Um, so the idea is, if you're checking in with yourself and you're fearful or you're angry or you're anxious or whatever that emotion happens to be that doesn't feel very positive or useful in the moment, there's a technique called a two-hand stress disintegrator.
Mhm.
And what you do is take one hand, doesn't matter right or left, and put it over your prefrontal cortex. You take your other hand and put it at the point of your occipital lobe. And the
Mhm.
way that it was explained to me is that when we are experiencing irrational fear, meaning that, there's not a bear that is
Mhm.
about to attack us, we're sitting in the library reading and we've got a cup of tea and here comes fear. That's irrational fear, just coming from our only thinking. We are projecting the worst case scenario that may happen from our prefrontal cortex, and we are projecting it into the theater of our imagination. Our occipital lobe is kind of
Mhm.
what powers our mental visualizations. So if we just do this or have somebody do this to us and breathe, the relationship that you have with the moment. And I actually have got a video I'll put down in the comments of this. When I did a series a while back called Spring into Mindfulness. And I told the story of this because I was up at like 3 o'clock in the morning. And my dog Daisy, who was like getting kind of in a hospice end of life situation, at 3 o'clock in the morning, she's tired and cold and wants to go to bed. I'm sitting here on this massive creative roll, recording all of these videos and feeling really good about it. Daisy's barking, and I just lose my shit. I started yelling at my dog, saying, shut up, shut up. And I started laughing. That turned out to be a pattern interrupt because here I am doing this training on mindfulness, and in the midst of like recording this training, I'm losing my shit. So I mean, there was a lot of uh, things to laugh about at that scenario. And as I started to tell the story about it on the recording, I got all choked up. And just out of habit, I did this. And I
Mhm.
had to make my way through the story, but my
Mhm.
dog was dying. So it was like an old yeller sort of moment that I just couldn't control the
Mhm.
emotions. And I was able to do it with this. And so I'm just going to
Mhm.
invite you to play along. Doesn't matter which way you go, but if you do three things. One is if you feel a state of overwhelm under a quote unquote negative emotion, just sit with it, feel it. Don't fight it, don't resist it. Just invite it into your awareness, and then do your hands like this. And what I'm told is that we are creating a new electrical circuit from our prefrontal cortex to the theater of our imagination. And we're just altering the current and just like interrupting the normal conditioned flow of that. And then what you started off, Fred, with in this podcast was breathe, because odds are
Mhm.
good if you're anxious or fearful or angry or whatever, you're not breathing. You're ready to do battle. And so if you just do that and then just make the decision to breathe and, do the 1 to 2, do the 2 to 3 breath, for every count that you're breathing in, breathe out 2, or for every 2 counts that you're breathing in, breathe
Right.
out 3, just a little bit longer. And that's going to start to trigger that vagus nerve. And I actually used to do this in corporate situations when people were overwhelmed. And, I was the manager, so I had to ask permission for it. But it
Mhm.
very quickly got to the point where everybody was doing it. It was just kind of like our thing. And,
Mhm.
either you'd see people doing it themselves, or if somebody saw that somebody else was overwhelmed, they would start doing it. And I don't
That's
understand
nice.
the science behind it. I don't know if you have some thoughts around
No, I
that,
mean,
Fred, or not. I just know it works.
yeah, I'd leave it at that. I think the science isn't that relevant if it works, and I love that your whole company was, or whatever was doing it.
My
That's
office, it
your
wasn't the whole
office, right?
company.
Yeah, that's still pretty fun. Um, anyway, I know we're over time here, so we should probably begin to mosey on back to the corral. Uh, so, any last thoughts from you?
Nope. I think that we have, the idea of presence and questions might be our next topic that we'll look at next week. And no additional thoughts. That
Awesome.
seems like a good place to round up. So let me
Yeah,
ask you, Fred, if folks want to get a hold of you, what's the easiest way to do that?
I think probably the easiest way is just to call me, honestly, or text me. It's the same number, which is 512-584-9075. I don't think that's on the banner down below. There is an email address there, Dr. Fred at energyrichliving.net. So there's another energy rich thing. But yeah, do that. You can email me or call me at 512-584-9075. And my standing invitation is that I will be, I'm happy to sit down and give you an experience of my work for an hour or so, no charge. Let's just see if there's something that I can help with. And then if you want to explore further coaching, we can, but let's just see if I can be of help first, service, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Thank you. And Fred also has a very cool group on Facebook called Being Dot Well. Is that right?
Yes,
Being
that
Dot
is
Well
also a
dot.
place people can find me from time to time. Yes.
Yeah. And that's an interesting group that is pursuing these ideas that we talk about in here
Hmm.
every week. And if you'd like to reach out to me, as I said, my clients that I have the most resonance with and most success with are those folks who are pretty goal oriented and thought that they would find happiness and bliss in external objects and the accumulation, the kind of the he who dies with the most toys wins mentality. And I help people make a shift to realizing that that happiness and bliss is actually internal to us. And once we've tapped into that, then going out into the world and creating and interacting and relating just simply becomes an entirely different game. So you can
Hmm.
reach me on Facebook as well. I'll put my contact information down there in the thing. And I have a group on Facebook as well called Our Mindful Life. So you can reach me in a DM or my email address is iamkobewan@gmail.com. So, Fred, man, it's always every Monday at this time is a pleasure because I get to interact with you and the other posse members. It's a true gift. So, thank you for the generosity of your
Thank you,
time, my
Bobby.
brother.
It's the same here. Uh, and of course, we miss Miriam and Jan and
The whole
Danielle
crew of
and,
Malcolm and yeah,
and whoever we're missing. Uh,
Malcolm.
Malcolm, that was the one. And so hopefully we all get to be together sometime soon. But it's a pleasure to be with you today and always fun to explore these topics.
And we'll be back next week, same time, everywhere we are broadcast. So until
Yay.
then, ciao for now.